It is the evening of the 3rd of September in the year 1878, and on the deck of a river steamer, the band is still playing. The boat is called the Princess Alice. She is a Thames pleasure steamer, long and low and crowded, coming home in the last of the daylight. All day she has carried Londoners downriver to the gardens at Rosherville and on to Sheerness. A shilling for the trip, a whole day out of the city, the one holiday a working family might take in a year. Now she is turning for home, past the marshes below Woolwich, her decks full of people who are tired and happy and almost back. Ahead of her in the dusk, coming the other way, is a shape much larger than herself. It is a collier, a coal ship, riding high and empty on the tide. She is called the Bywell Castle. For a few seconds, the two vessels seem to be reading each other wrongly, each turning toward the water the other has chosen. Then the collier's iron bow comes down on the Princess Alice just forward of her paddle box and cuts her nearly in two. She goes down in under 4 minutes. Somewhere around 650 people go down with her, the worst loss of life on Britain's inland waters that there has ever been, before or since. 2 ships collided on a clear evening, and that part is quickly told. This file is about the 3 questions that follow from it, and they are harder. Why did so many die so fast? 4 minutes from a bank they could see, on a river inside the largest city in the world. Why has nobody, in the century and a half since, been able to say for certain how many they were, or name most of them? And why did 2 official bodies, examining the same evening and hearing many of the same witnesses, arrive at 2 different answers about whose fault it was? The Princess Alice had left Swan Pier near London Bridge that morning, run down to Gravesend and Sheerness with her decks full, and turned back up the river in the early evening. As the light failed, she was coming up through the reaches below Woolwich on the last leg home. It was a mild evening. There was music. Somewhere in the crowd, a band was playing, and families were gathering their things for the last mile. The reach the boat was entering, Gallions Reach below Tripcock Point, was a wide, familiar stretch of the tidal river. There was nothing about it to warn anyone. Coming down that reach toward her was the Bywell Castle. She was a screw-driven iron collier in the region of 1,000 tons and better, which made her several times the steamer's weight, and she was running light and empty on her way north to load coal. She had a Thames pilot aboard, as a vessel of her size in that water was expected to. Accounts put her fresh from a refit and newly painted on her way out of the river. The 2 vessels sighted each other in the failing light, with plenty of water between them. Whatever went wrong in the last 2 or 3 minutes, and it went wrong in the space of a few decisions. Here, the rule of the age is worth stating because its weakness is the heart of the case. On the open sea, a settled code already governed how 2 power-driven vessels meeting head-on should pass. Each altered course to starboard so that they went by port to port, and every officer knew it. It had the force of regulation behind it, and it worked because both parties could rely on the other party obeying it. On the tidal Thames below London, that code was neither clearly established nor uniformly obeyed. Rivermen worked to the set of the tide instead, and to a local custom of keeping to the deeper water and to the slacker water, according to which way you were going. There was sense in that custom. A loaded vessel going one way and a light vessel going the other have different reasons to want different parts of the channel, and the tide is the thing that governs a river. What the custom did not do was tell 2 power-driven boats meeting in a reach exactly what each of them was going to do next. They were left, in practice, to read each other's intentions. Then each altered course. One turn should have been answered by the other so that they passed port to port. safely apart. Whose fault the next seconds were would be argued for years in 2 courts and is argued still. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The 2 boats turned toward the same water. Each master, seeing the other come on, tried at the last moment to correct, and the corrections made it worse. The gap closed. At around 7:15 in the evening, the Bywell Castle's iron bow struck the Princess Alice on her starboard side, just forward of the paddle box, and drove deep into her. The steamer was cut almost in 2. The water came in along her whole length. In 3 to 4 minutes, she broke apart and went under in a reach deep enough to close over her completely. The crowd went into the dark water together. The crew of the Bywell Castle threw ropes over the side and lowered what boats they had, and other vessels in the reach came on as fast as they could, and there was almost no time for any of it. Watermen who were on the river that evening pulled people out. Of the many hundreds aboard, a small number were saved. Captain William Grinstead of the Princess Alice was among the dead. It is worth being clear about how the few who lived did it, because the pattern is instructive rather than random. Almost all of them were on the open deck when she was struck, and near enough to a rail to go into the water rather than down inside the hull. Some caught the ropes the collier's crew put over her side and were hauled up. Some were picked out by the boats and the watermen. A few could swim, which in that crowd made them exceptional. Nobody who was below in the saloon, where the band was and where a good many families were sitting, had any realistic chance at all. 4 minutes is not enough time to get a crowd up a companionway, so the survivors were, disproportionately, adult men who happened to be standing in the right part of the boat. That is not a comment on anybody's conduct. It is what happens when a vessel goes down in 4 minutes with no drill, no order, and no time, and it is the same finding this catalogue reaches again and again. To understand how a 4-minute sinking on a river killed 650 people an hour from home, you have to know what that boat was, who was standing on her deck, and what was in the water beneath her. 3 things, and they compound. Start with the boat. She had no bulkheads to speak of, no watertight compartments divided her hull, because a light excursion boat working smooth water was not expected to need them, and no rule of 1878 said she must have them. That is why 1 wound amidships flooded her from end to end. A collision that a subdivided vessel might have survived with a flooded forward compartment took her whole hull at once. She also had nothing like enough boats, and here the arithmetic is stark. A vessel licensed to carry many hundreds of excursion passengers carried a handful of small craft on deck. Nobody has ever seriously argued the boats were the failure in this case, because there was no time to launch anything at all. 4 minutes is not an evacuation, it is barely a warning. The absence of boats mattered less than the absence of minutes. Then, the crowd. The cheap ticket is the whole story of who died. In the London of the 1870s, the river steamer was the poor family's holiday. For a shilling, sometimes less, a clerk or a shopkeeper or a servant on her 1 free day could step aboard at a city pier in the morning, be carried down to the pleasure gardens at Rosherville, where there were walks and music and tea and a maze, and be carried home again by night. It was respectable, it was affordable, and it was crowded. Whole families went together in their good clothes on a summer's day off. By 1878, the Princess Alice belonged to the London Steamboat Company, which ran a large fleet of these boats in fierce competition for the day-tripper trade, and she was among the most popular vessels on the river. Nobody knows exactly how many people were aboard her. That fact, the not knowing, sits at the center of everything that follows, so it is worth being precise about why. The passenger regulation of the day gave the company a wide license. An excursion steamer sold tickets at the pier in the morning and sold more at the landing stages downriver through the day, kept no register of who came aboard, and counted no children in arms at all. The law set no requirement that a riverboat account for the people on her deck by name, or even reliably by number. So she carried an unknown crowd, full the way an excursion boat on a warm holiday was always full, with people standing at the rails and sitting on the deck and crowding the saloon below where the music was. Most of them could not swim. Swimming was not, in 1878, a thing most working Londoners had ever been taught, and the women's clothes of that age, long and heavy and layered, filled and pulled downward the moment they were wet, which is a plain physical fact and one of the reasons the dead were so disproportionately women and children. And then there is the reach itself, which held a third fact, invisible from the deck. An hour or so before the Princess Alice came through, the great sewer outfalls at Barking and Crossness, the northern and southern mouths of London's new drainage system, had opened on the ebb tide and discharged the untreated sewage of the whole city into the river. The water those passengers fell into was, at that hour and in that place, among the foulest water in England. That is dealt with properly later in this file because it became a scandal of its own. It is worth knowing where the Princess Alice came from because she was not built for the river that killed her. She was built in Scotland in 1865 on the Clyde, and she first ran under another name. As the Bute, she carried passengers on the Firth of Clyde in open coastal water on the west of Scotland. Within a couple of years, she was sold south, brought round to the Thames, renamed for a daughter of Queen Victoria, and put to work as a saloon steamer on the London excursion runs. She was long, shallow and iron-hulled, driven by paddle wheels, with a single funnel and a saloon below. That form is the right one for what she did. A long, light hull moves a great many people quickly through smooth water on very little coal, and shallow draft lets her come alongside a pier anywhere on the river. Every quality that made her good at her trade also made her fragile in a collision, and nobody in 1878 regarded that as a problem to solve, because in the ordinary way of things, excursion steamers did not get hit by colliers. Rosherville is worth a moment, because it is the destination that fills the boat, and it has vanished so completely that the name means nothing now. It was a pleasure garden laid out in a worked-out chalk quarry near Northfleet, down the river on the Kent side, and it had been built for precisely this traffic. Terraced walks in the chalk, a bear pit, a maze, gardens, a theatre, dancing, a band, tea. Its advertising called it the place to spend a happy day, and for a generation of Londoners with 1 day off and a shilling to spend, it was exactly that. You could not reach it easily except by water, which was the point. The garden existed because the steamers did, and the steamers ran full because the garden was there. The trade she worked was enormous, and it was new. Cheap rail and cheap steam had between them invented the day trip, and London, a city of millions with almost no green space for its working population, took to it completely. Rosherville Gardens at Northfleet existed for exactly this traffic. Pleasure grounds laid out in an old chalk pit, advertised as the place to spend a happy day. The boats ran down to it all summer, several companies competing on price and on speed, and speed on a crowded tidal river is the thing to keep in mind. Because that is the commercial pressure underneath this case. A company running excursion steamers for a shilling a head makes its money on volume and on turnaround. The boats were full because full was the business, and they moved briskly because briskly was the business, and the river they did it on carried the working traffic of the largest port in the world at the same time. Colliers, barges, lighters, tugs, ocean ships coming up to the docks, thousands of movements a week in a channel a few hundred yards wide under a custom rather than a rule. One more thing about the Reach itself. Gallions Reach was not a quiet backwater that a pleasure boat had wandered into. It sat at the seaward end of London's docks, and within 2 years of the disaster, the entrance to the new Royal Albert Dock would open onto it, which tells you what kind of water it was, the approach to the busiest port on earth. The Thames below London carried an enormous volume of movements every week, colliers and lighters and tugs and ocean ships working up to the docks, threaded through by excursion steamers full of families on a shilling ticket. Those two traffics shared a channel a few hundred yards wide under a custom rather than a rule, and they had been doing it for years without a catastrophe, which is exactly why nobody had written the rule. Her master that day was Captain William Grinstead. He was an experienced riverman who knew the tidal reaches. He had made this run many times, and there was nothing unusual about the day, the tide, or the traffic. It was, until the last 2 minutes, entirely routine. He died with his ship, which is worth stating plainly, because a good deal of what was said afterward was said about a man who could not answer it. What happened over the following days is the part of this case that reads least like a shipwreck and most like an administrative catastrophe, and it is where the missing passenger list does its real damage. The dead came out of the river for a long time. Bodies were recovered that evening, and through the next day, and for days after that as the tide worked them up and down the reach, and they were brought ashore at Woolwich and laid in the dockyard there because there was nowhere else with the space. Watermen were paid a fee for each recovery, which is how such things were then arranged. This file will not dwell on that. What matters is the problem it created. The authorities had several hundred dead and no list of who had been aboard. There was no manifest to check them against, no count of tickets sold that could be turned into names, and no way even to know when they had finished, because the total was unknown. So, identification was thrown onto the public. Relatives came down to Woolwich in their thousands and were walked through to look for their own, day after day, and what could not be identified by face was identified by clothing, by a ring, by the contents of a pocket. Whole families had gone on the boat together, which meant that in many cases there was nobody left to come and look. That is the mechanism by which around 650 people become a number rather than a list. The figure the authorities eventually settled on was arrived at by adding the bodies recovered to the people reported missing by somebody, and it was never precise. Some accounts put it a little lower and some a little higher. The true number went down with the boat, and so did most of the names. The country read all of it. The disaster landed in the middle of the great age of illustrated weekly journalism, and the papers gave it everything they had: the collision, the reach, the dockyard at Woolwich, the crowds waiting for news, the funerals. The Illustrated London News and its competitors put engravings of the scene in front of a national readership within days, and the daily press carried the inquest almost verbatim for weeks. That coverage is the reason this case is so well documented, and it is also part of why the reforms came. It was not possible for anybody in public life to treat 650 drowned Londoners as a local shipping matter when the whole country had been reading about it every morning. London's response was immediate and, by the standards of the time, generous. A public relief fund was opened for the families and subscribed to widely, from large donations down to very small ones. The Lord Mayor was involved, as he generally was in such things. The money mattered, because most of the dead were the earners in households that had no other provision, and a working family that lost a father in 1878 lost its income entirely. Accounts of the recovery, the dockyard, and the relief funds administration rest substantially on the book-length studies of this disaster rather than on the inquiry papers, and the detail there is fuller than this summary. There is one more part of the recovery, and it is the reason a good many of the dead were found at all. The Princess Alice was lying in a working navigation channel in two pieces, in water shallow enough that she was a hazard to everything using the river. She had to be lifted, and quickly, and the lifting was done within about a week. Salvage craft raised her sections and brought them up and put them ashore in the Reach, and a great many of the dead were recovered in the process from inside the saloon where the music had been and where people below decks had had no chance at all of reaching the open air in 4 minutes. That is the last of it that this file will describe. What the raising established beyond the recoveries was the damage. A wound in her starboard side forward of the paddle box, deep enough to have taken her open in a hull with nothing inside it to stop the water going the length of her. The physical evidence and the witness evidence agreed on where she was struck. They never agreed on why. The inquest is the first of the two proceedings, and it is the more remarkable of them. A coroner's court in 1878 was a local body with a narrow statutory job to establish who the dead were and when, where and by what means they came by their deaths. It was not built to conduct a technical investigation into the navigation of two steam vessels. The coroner at Woolwich had that job anyway, because the dead were in his district and he did it at length. The inquest sat over a period of weeks, took evidence from a long succession of witnesses, and became a public event in its own right, reported daily. The witnesses were the people who had been on the river, survivors from the Princess Alice, in numbers small enough to be a problem in itself, officers and crew from the Bywell Castle, including her master and her pilot, watermen who had been working the Reach, people who had watched from the bank. Their accounts did not agree, and the disagreement was not marginal. It went to the central question of who altered course, when, and which way, in the last 2 minutes. Witnesses on one vessel described the other doing something that witnesses on the other vessel denied. Some of that is ordinary. A collision at dusk is confusing, memory is poor, and people who have survived something reconstruct it. Some of it was plainly interested, because blame in a case of this size carried consequences. The jury returned a verdict of death by drowning. It found that the Bywell Castle had not taken proper precautions, and that the Princess Alice had contributed to the collision by a wrong movement of her helm. It also made recommendations, as coroners' juries did, about how the river ought to be run in future. Note what that verdict does. It apportions to both, and it puts the greater share of the failure on the collier. It is worth saying what a proceeding like that cost the people in it. The inquest ran for weeks in a public room, reported in the papers each day, with survivors describing the worst evening of their lives to a jury, and then reading it back in print the following morning. Several of the witnesses had lost family in the water they were being asked to describe. The court had no power to compensate anybody and no power to punish anybody. A coroner's jury returns a verdict and makes recommendations, and there it ends. What it could do and did was put the whole evening on the public record in the words of the people who had been there, which is why this case is documented as thoroughly as it is. The second proceeding was the Board of Trade inquiry, and it was the proper technical forum. The board had jurisdiction over merchant shipping casualties, it had the power to examine officers' certificates, and it heard the navigation of the two vessels as a navigation question rather than as a question about the cause of death. It concluded, in substance, that the Princess Alice had been improperly handled. Her helm, on that finding, had been put the wrong way in the crucial seconds, and had she held her course, the collision might have been avoided. So the record contains two official findings on the same evening from two bodies, hearing many of the same witnesses, and they do not sit comfortably together. One puts the greater weight on the collier for failing to take proper precautions, the other puts it on the steamer for a wrong movement of the helm. This file is not going to resolve that, because it cannot be resolved. What can be said is why it happened, and the reason is not that one court was careless. The two bodies were asking different questions under different statutes with different tests. A coroner's jury of local men was asking how these people came to die and was free to say that a large vessel bearing down on a crowded excursion boat should have been more careful. The Board of Trade was asking which vessel's handling breached the practice of good seamanship and was examining the conduct of certificated officers with their livelihoods at stake. Those two questions can honestly produce two answers, and behind both of them lay a set of failures much larger than either master. The rules of the road come first. In 1878, there was no clear, firmly established convention telling two power-driven vessels meeting in a reach of the tidal Thames exactly how to pass. On the open sea, such rules had force. On the crowded river below London, they were vague and inconsistently followed, and the two boats had been left to guess each other's intentions in the dusk. They guessed wrongly. Two experienced men, each doing what he thought correct, put their vessels in the same water. Then the overcrowding, which no one could measure because no one had counted, and the water, deep and cold and fouled by the outfalls that had opened an hour before. Survivors and rescuers spoke of it afterward, and doctors believed some of those pulled out alive were harmed by what they had swallowed. It did not cause the collision, it made the drowning worse. One clear chain, then: no river rules to keep the boats apart, no bulkheads to keep the water out, no list to give the dead even a name, and a stretch of poisoned river to fall into. Any one of these on its own would have been a scandal. There is a piece of this case that produces more anger than the collision does, and it belongs in the record because it is a rule rather than an accident. Merchant shipping law of the period allowed a shipowner, in a case of loss where he was not personally at fault, to limit his liability to a figure calculated from the tonnage of his vessel. The reasoning behind it was commercial and, in its own terms, coherent. Shipping was a risky trade, unlimited liability would make it uninsurable, and a predictable ceiling let owners operate and let underwriters price the risk. Applied to the Princess Alice, that principle produced an outcome that reads as an insult. She was a small, light, shallow river steamer. Her tonnage was modest. The ceiling on her owner's liability was therefore modest, and it was being set against a loss of around 650 lives. The sum available to be divided among the families of the dead, under the law as it stood, bore no relation whatever to what had happened, and the public relief fund, raised by subscription from ordinary Londoners, was the larger part of what those families actually received. So, the compensation for the worst loss of life in the history of Britain's inland waters came substantially from charity rather than from liability, because the tonnage of the boat was small. That was not a failure of the law. It was the law working exactly as designed, and the design had not imagined a vessel of that size carrying that many people. The sewage needs its own account, because it is the strangest fact in the case and because it produced the most lasting reform. London had spent the 1860s building one of the great engineering works of the century. Joseph Bazalgette's main drainage system was the answer to the Great Stink and to a cholera-ridden city that had been drinking its own waste, and it worked. It gathered the sewage of millions into vast intercepting sewers running east, and it delivered it well downstream of the city, to outfalls at Barking on the north bank and Crossness on the south. But it delivered it, in 1878, entirely untreated. The design assumption was that the tide would take it out to sea, and to make the most of that assumption, the outfalls were held and then released on the ebb in great volumes at intervals. That is what had happened an hour or so before the Princess Alice came up the Reach. Both mouths had discharged on the ebb tide into the water she was about to break apart in. Two things followed. The first is that a great many people who might otherwise have been pulled out alive were in water carrying the raw sewage of a city of millions, and the medical opinion of the time held that some of the survivors were made seriously ill by it. The second is that the disaster put the outfalls on the front page. It had been possible, before September 1878, to regard the discharge as somebody else's problem happening somewhere downstream. It was not possible afterward. Within a few years, a royal commission was examining the discharge of London's sewage into the Thames, and the conclusion was that releasing it raw was not acceptable. Treatment works followed, precipitation of the solids, and eventually the practice of taking sludge out to sea by ship rather than putting it in the river at Barking. The reform of how London disposed of its waste has many causes, and the Princess Alice is one of the moments that pushed it forward. It is an odd kind of legacy. 650 people drowned in a river, and one of the things that changed as a result was the river. The other reforms were closer to the collision itself. In the years that followed, the rules for navigating the tidal Thames were tightened and made explicit, with regulations covering how steam vessels should pass one another on the river, so that two boats meeting in a reach need not read each other's minds. The custom that had governed Gallions Reach was replaced by something a master could be held to. Specifically, bylaws for the tidal river were drawn up and given force in the years immediately following, setting out how vessels were to pass in the reaches, which side to take, what signals to give, and what a master was required to do on sighting another power-driven vessel head-on. The local custom that had governed Gallions Reach was written down and made enforceable, which is the whole of the reform in one sentence. The thing the two masters had been left to guess became a thing they could be held to. The policing of the river was strengthened, and the Thames police took on a larger role in a waterway that had just demonstrated how lethal its ordinary traffic could be. And there was the question of the passengers themselves. That a boat could carry many hundreds of people with no record of who they were and no means of accounting for them afterward was for the Victorians a genuine shock, and it fed the slow tightening of the rules about what excursion vessels could carry, how they were surveyed, and what they had to record. And there is a postscript about the other vessel that the record does not miss. The Bywell Castle came out of the collision essentially undamaged, went on about her business, and was lost herself less than 5 years later. In 1883 she sailed and was never seen again, with all hands, somewhere in the Atlantic. No cause was ever established, and nothing of her was found. The ship that cut the Princess Alice in two ended as a disappearance of the kind this catalogue is full of. Rosherville did not last either. The garden that had filled those boats depended on a public that believed the trip down was a pleasant nothing, and it went into a long decline and eventually closed, and the chalk pit it had been laid out in was put to other uses. There is very little to see there now, and the figure itself has never settled. 650 is the number the authorities arrived at, and the number that has been carried ever since, but it was only ever an addition of bodies recovered to persons reported missing, and later students of the case have put it a little lower and a little higher. The uncertainty is not carelessness on anybody's part, it is the direct arithmetic consequence of a boat that sold tickets to an unrecorded crowd, and it is the most durable thing this disaster left behind, a memorial to a number nobody can verify. The London Steamboat Company did not prosper after it. A company whose entire business was persuading families that a day on the river was a safe and cheerful way to spend a shilling, had lost 650 of them in 4 minutes in the most heavily reported disaster of the decade, and the trade never recovered its innocence. Most of the dead were never identified. They had gone into the river together, ordinary Londoners in their holiday clothes, and many came out unknown. The unknown among them were buried together at Woolwich, in a common grave paid for by public subscription, money given in very small amounts by very large numbers of ordinary people, so that strangers might be buried decently. Over that grave, a memorial cross was raised, and it stands there still in the cemetery at Woolwich, a marble cross for the unnamed of the Princess Alice, put up by a city that had settled on a figure of 650 and could not tell you a single one of their names for certain. They had done nothing but take the cheap ticket, a shilling a day out, the one holiday of the year. They were clerks and servants and children, a whole crowd of ordinary lives, tired and happy, coming home in the dark. They were an hour from the pier when the collier's bow came down out of the dusk, and the river closed over them in less time than it takes to tell. London built its reforms on them, the rules of the river, the policing of it, and in the end, the cleaning of it. The cross at Woolwich stands over them still. The General Slocum burned on the East River 26 years later on another day out, with another crowd of families aboard and another set of rules that had never been enforced. That investigation is the companion to this one.